Hi, I'm Toby from Toby's Urban Sketch. Thank you for joining me today, and got another little video for you here. This one's a tips and tricks video. It's talking about granulating watercolours. What is granulation, why do I like granulation, and how do I use it in my sketching? The reason for this is that someone asked me a question in one of the comments, what is granulating watercolours? And I talk about them a lot and I love them, and my palette is filled with them, so I thought let's just do a video about it. So watercolours are made up of pigments and then things binding the pigments together. The pigments are coded, so if you look at your watercolour tubes, you'll see on the back they've got little things. I'm not sure if you can see in this video, but for example, Lunar Black is PBK11, Cobalt Blue is PB28, and then Phthalo Blue is again another pigment. Sometimes there are mixes of pigments as well, which we'll come to shortly in this video. Different pigments have different sizes. The man-made pigments tend to be very fine, whereas natural pigments tend to be a bit more irregular or a bit bigger. And what does that mean? Well, if we take, for example, this Phthalo Blue, this has a very fine pigment in it. So if I just take a tiny bit and do a little swatch here, and then we let that dry, we'll see that it is going to dry in a very even and relatively flat, non-textured manner. We could do the same with Scarlet Lake, which is a red, and then we can do the same with any of the quinacridone colours, because quinacridone is also fine particles. So if we do quinacridone gold, now you can already see these are all very flat, and the reason is these are made from man-made, very fine particles. If we go into the next category, I've called them a bit granulating, and for me these are colours like a cerulean blue, which is normally a bit granulating. In my palette I've also got a burnt umber, which is normally a bit granulating. And then something else in here would be a cobalt blue, which is also normally a bit granulating. And didn't do a very good job with the amount of water there, but as these dry, you can already see that they're drying in a more irregular manner. So there's more little bumps and clumping in the surface, and they don't produce this really flat colour. And then what are colours which granulate a lot? Well, there's a couple of classic ones that I've got on my palette and one that I don't. So one that I don't at the moment is Lunar Black, but this is incredibly granulating. So if I just drop a bit more pigment in there, we'll just see as that dries just how irregular the clumps go. And then we can do the same with, so any of the lunar colours from Daniel Smith. So I have Lunar Earth, which I love just for this very effect. And what tends to happen is it takes a little while to come off evident, but the drier it gets, the more that we see how irregular it is. And then the last one that I'll show you, but I have a few in here. Last one is Moonglow. And the reason I want to mention Moonglow as well is because Moonglow is a pigment mix, and this is where you don't necessarily need to know, but it's good that Daniel Smith understand their pigments, because this is made up of 3 different pigments. One is Viridian, so it's a green, one is alizarin crimson, and one is a ultramarine. Ultramarine is a sort of fairly heavily granulating pigment often. The others less so, but they all have different weights. So what happens is you get this separating out into 3 different colours, where the green and the red tend to cause this greyish tone. The ultramarine then settles and clumps, as you can already see happening. And the red floats a lot more, so the red floats to the edges, so you can see this sort of greeny grey in the middle, the red floating around to the edges, and then these dark clumps. So one of the important things about granulation is it gets more obvious as it dries. So if we just have a quick look, we can see these are all rather flat. There's a little bit of granulation in the quinacridone, you can see. But even where this water is washed into the Scarlet Lake, there isn't really clumping. If we move on to our moderately granulating colours, you can see a little bit in a few places where the pigment has clumped. But then if we go to our very granulating colours, it's really obvious. You can see these sort of craters. It's almost like the surface of the moon, which is why they called it lunar. So you can see so much granulation. There's almost white and then very brown. It's really separated out. And then with our moon glow, you can see the granulation of the dark colours, but with this outline of slightly pinky red and a base of green as well. So an obvious question then is, what's the point? And we see what it does, but what's the point? Why try and find these granulations? Well, I'll just take you through a few of my recent sketches, and we can see how they've granulated or not, and how that adds to them. So, for example, in this sketch, you can see the sky, which is what I was trying to really bring out, is granulated. It's got all this texture going on, whereas these buildings, which I'm trying to sort of push into the back, are just a little gentle flat wash. The same thing is evident in this sketch. Really trying to make a feature of the sky, so using a heavily granulating colour gets you all these textures, whilst the building is flat and more illustrative and sort of sitting in front of all of that. In this silly cat that I drew, you can see in a more abstract way where you can utilise these granulations. So look at all these dark black granulations, which are almost suggesting whiskers or something different about the texture at the front of the cat's face. And similarly, we've got these blue granulations, and back here we've got more of these dark granulations. We've even got some red granulations, but they're just, all of this granulation effect is just suggesting texture and giving the eye something more interesting to look at than just a flat wash of colour. This is another obvious example. So we've got granulation in these darker areas, a little bit in these trees as well, and down here, and the granulation is drawing the eye, suggesting a bit of shadow, whilst these background areas are a flat wash, and a lot of the sky is very flat. But then just to get a bit of moodiness in there, there's a bit of moon glow which is granulated and suggests something ominous like clouds going on. So they're just a few examples of how granulation can be used to emphasize something, to create textures, to bring something forward, or even create a mood.